In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your own fizzy kombucha at home in less than 10 minutes of active time. So kombucha is basically a sweetened tea that is fermented and then flavored. It's full of probiotics which are good for your gut and digestive system. On top of that, after your first fermentation with the tea, you can do a second fermentation. You can add even more nutritional value by including things like fruits, herbs, and even aromatics like ginger. Now, you've probably heard of this, and you can't make kombucha without it. It's this weird, ugly looking thing that kind of looks like a giant piece of booger. So this is SCOBY, also known as symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Essentially, it's a living colony of beneficial organism that metabolizes the sugar and caffeine in sweet tea to produce healthy acids, enzymes, and probiotics. If you know a friend who also makes kombucha, you can ask them for a piece of SCOBY. A SCOBY will multiply over time, about every other batch. Or, you can click on the Amazon link below to get your own. Real quick, before we get started, I want to talk about another benefit of brewing your own kombucha. If you drink a lot of juice and pop, try substituting them with kombucha. Because of the fermentation process, most of the caffeine and sugar will be converted to acids and probiotics, so it's 100% the healthier option. Also, everyone knows that store-bought kombucha can be pretty expensive, and it really adds up on your grocery bill. My girlfriend used to spend $7, $8, $9, $10 on a bottle of kombucha, and she can just smash the whole thing in a day. And that's kind of why I started brewing our own kombucha during the pandemic. If you want to know how much money you and I can save by brewing our own kombucha, click on this video right here. To start this off, we're going to make a tea concentration. Only black, green, and white teas would have the nutrients the SCOBY would need to produce acids. This means no red teas or herbal teas. And stay away from teas with added flavors and oils like Earl Grey and chai. Now, black teas is the better choice because they has the highest nutritional value for the SCOBY. I would also recommend using loose tea leaves because they tend to be higher in quality and they're more cost efficient. Here I'm using a combination of loose jasmine green tea and a couple of black tea bags. I happen to have a giant box of it, so I decided to use those up before I get more loose black tea leaves. You guys can definitely play around with the combinations of tea to your preference. Here's a chart of measurements you guys can follow. You'll want to pick a recipe based on how big your brewing vessel is. Speaking of brewing vessel, only glass ones would work because the acids will react with plastic or metal. Check out the links below for the supplies that I recommend. Alright, first off, we're going to bring 600 milliliters of water to a boil and immediately remove it from the heat. Add in your tea leaves of your choice and let it steep for 5 to 8 minutes. Then add your white sugar and stir until it's all melted. Now, set up a strainer with a coffee filter to strain your tea. Next, add in cool water, not cold, because if this gets too cold, it's going to slow down your first ferment. Think of it like making bread. If your dough is too cold, your yeast is going to work very slowly. But if it gets too hot, your yeast will die. I never really measure this part and I normally just top this off with water, leaving just enough room for our starter liquid. A starter liquid is a mature unflavored kombucha from a previous batch that's been reserved. If this is your first time brewing your own kombucha, don't worry, the SCOBY kit that I have linked below comes with the starter liquid as well. Before you add the starter liquid, make sure your tea has cooled down to room temperature. Then add in your starter liquid, and lastly, lay your SCOBY on top. Sometimes if your SCOBY is not mature or if it's been sitting in the fridge for a while, it may or may not float. Just leave it for a couple of days and once it's active again, it should float to the top. Cover your vessel with cheesecloth, tea towel, paper towel, or a coffee filter and secure tightly with a rubber band. Anything that can prevent dust from getting in but allows airflow would work. Also, make sure you label your vessel so you can keep track on how long it's been fermenting. The first stage of fermentation will take anywhere around 6 to 14 days. How long it takes depends on a couple of things. Temperature is a huge factor in brewing kombucha in both stages of fermentation. If where you are is warmer, it's gonna go quicker and vice versa. This will also depend on how acidic and strong you want your kombucha to be. I would recommend start tasting your kombucha after day 6 until you're happy with the acidity and taste. When it's ready, it should be acidic, but not acidic like vinegar. It also shouldn't be very sweet because the sugar is supposed to turn into acids. If yours is still kind of sweet, just go for another day or 2 and keep tasting them daily. Also, make sure your booch is not in direct sunlight. You want your ferment to stay in an environment with a consistent temperature. Alright, so that is it for our first stage of fermentation. Now we're ready to take this a step further to make it even better. Although a lot of people should stop here and consume it as is, we're going to flavor it and carbonate our booch with a second fermentation. So like I said earlier, you can pretty much use any fruits, herbs, and aromatics you want. Just nothing with oils, fats, and starch like avocados, coconut, or bananas. One of my favorite flavors is inspired by a cocktail, and it's grape mojito, using black grapes, fresh mint, lime peel, and juice. The possibilities are just endless, and this is where you can experiment and get creative. Leave a comment below and let me know what flavors you guys are going with. Today we are using raspberries and ginger. The amount of fruit juice and puree does not have to be exact, and I recommend doing this part by feel. Some people like their booch juicier, and some prefer just a hint of flavor and more of the tea itself. As long as you have about 100 milliliters of juice or puree in each liter, you should be good. We're going to peel and dice about 2 thumb-sized ginger and a pint of fresh raspberries. If you are using fruits that are more on the sour side, I would recommend adding a small amount of sugar. If you're using fruits that are already sweet on their own, you won't need additional sugar. Here I'm adding a couple of teaspoons of white sugar along with a splash of water so it blends well and it doesn't get too thick. Blend this up until nice and smooth, and we'll pass this through a fine strainer and set this aside. So my brewing vessel for my first ferment is about 3.3 liter, so it brews exactly 3 1-liter bottles, with enough to also reserve a cup of starter liquid for my next batch. Give your tea a stir because the good stuff in settlement usually sits in the bottom. Then reserve the amount of starter liquid you need depending on how big of a batch you guys are brewing next. A SCOBY with liquid can be stored in fridge for up to 6 months. Just make sure it's in an airtight container. Some people will also call this a SCOBY hotel. Divide your fruit puree evenly into your glass bottles. Same as the brewing vessel, these also have to be made of glass. I find that bottles with small, narrow mouths like these work a lot better. I've tried using something like this, but this didn't quite work. Then give your tea a quick stir again. I recommend pouring it into something like a pitcher first, so it's easier to pour. Otherwise, you probably end up making a mess and wasting good booch. Here I'm just a little shy, so I'm topping it off with water. Obviously, if you have enough booch, just ignore the water. I find that filling them up almost all the way up, leaving about an inch of air pocket, works best. Making sure the mouth of the bottle is clean so that it can have a good seal. Keeping it airtight and trapping the carbon dioxide during the second fermentation is what makes it fizzy and carbonated. Same thing, make sure you label them so you can keep track of your ferments, especially if you have multiple batches going on at the same time. We're going to leave these bottles out at room temp. The second ferment usually takes 2 to 5 days. Again, your room temperature will also determine the rate of your fermentation. If this is your first time, I would recommend burping your bottles every 24 hours. To burp them means you're opening the bottle for a quick second to release pressure and closing the bottles right away. I've never had this happen to me, but there are in some cases the bottles would explode because there's too much pressure inside the glass. Once you're experienced, you'll probably find that you only need to burp them when you see bubbles rising near the top like this. When it gets to a fizzy level that you like, chill them in the fridge for minimum an hour before drinking. Now I know I just gave you guys a whole lot of information, but once you get the hang of it, it really only takes you about 5 minutes to do your first and second ferment. The rest is just letting it sit while you wait for the magic to happen. So that's it guys. please give making your own kombucha a try. It's super easy to make, healthy, and delicious. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment down below and tell me what flavors you guys went with. If you are still here, thank you for watching all the way to the end of my very first video. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.